You're listening to Dakota Spotlight, a production of Forum Communications. My name is James Woolner. This is the 5th episode in a summer series of interviews with podcast producers from around the world and other people looking for answers and seeking justice. This episode contains some very serious adult subject matter. If you have kids around, maybe you should just listen later. This week we're traveling to the United Kingdom to speak with Dan Box. Dan Box is a crime reporter in the UK, but he spends a lot of his time in Australia. Today we're going to be talking about the podcast Bowraville, which is a project Dan worked on for the newspaper named The Australian. The Bowraville podcast investigates the unsolved murders of 3 Aboriginal children in rural Australia. It's a sometimes fascinating, sometimes frustrating story, and I highly recommend that you listen to it. Again, it's called Bowraville, B-O-W-R-A, Ville, V-I-L-L-E. So here is Dan Box to talk about the podcast Bowraville. Dan Box, thank you so much for joining me on Dakota Spotlight podcast. How are you today and where are you today?
Hey, I'm good. I am in the north of England, which is where we're living in a former lockdown at the moment. And it's a pleasure to be here. Look, it's a real privilege to get to talk to you and to get to talk about this case.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I listened to your podcast and it's, I thought you did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
Can you tell us, a little more about yourself? Did I see this right on Twitter that you're a rock climber or something?
Oh, yeah, a little bit. I mean, no great shakes at all. I climb a bit, I run a bit, I bike a bit, I swim a bit, like a lot of people. Where we live, and the reason to move to where we do live now is we're in the middle of a national park. So we've got hills all around us and a great set of cliffs just you can see from the front door of the house. It's kind of one of the sacred places of British rock climbing. It's called Stanage. And so we're fortunate. We can literally, knock off work. And last night I ran up to the crag and went climbing. It was great.
That sounds great. Can you explain your association with the Australian and how you got involved with working in Australia? Or were you born there? Or? Yeah,
I was. I was born in Sydney. I'm what they call over there a boomerang pom. So I think it's pretty common. You get these people, English people, so they call them poms. And we go to Australia and we love it, but we've got family at home, so we go back. But we love Australia, so we move back to Australia, but we've got family at home. So I've done that a few times now, boomeranging back and forth. So I was born over there, grew up in the UK, and literally it was a dream. My whole childhood, my dream was to go back to Australia. And Australia was blue skies and beaches and big horizons. Eventually, I trained as a journalist and I deliberately chose the university I did my postgrad in newspaper journalism in because it offered a bursary. Like one student got to go and work on this newspaper in Australia called The Australian, it's the Murdoch broadsheet. So it's probably the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal over there. Big emphasis on business, big emphasis on sort of serious reporting.
Okay, so can you tell us about how you first heard about these murders? Because I believe it was several years before you kind of tackled the story.
I first heard about these murders when I got an invitation to meet with a homicide detective. And that was unusual back then. I was a crime reporter. And it was never the case that detectives asked to meet you. I mean, my job was constantly asking to meet detectives, trying to take them out for coffees, trying to take them out for drinks, just to talk to them. But in this case, the guy wanted to meet me. So I went in and I sat down with him. And he told me about a murder. Well, it was 3 murders. 3 murders of 3 children, unsolved, in a small country town on the mid-north coast of New South Wales called Bowraville. And this detective, a guy called Gary Jubilant, had been working that case for about 20 years at that point. And, normally if you meet a guy for a coffee, you might be talking for half an hour. I remember 2 hours later, we left the cafe and went into the homicide unit, and he starts pulling out files. And I'd kind of heard the name Bowraville a bit. I was a crime reporter and it was a big unsolved murder. I should have heard about it, but I'd never thought about it. And at the end of that meeting, I went back to the office, and I remember I was looking at some of these documents he'd copied for me, and one of my colleagues said to me, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, Bowraville." And he said, "Oh, yeah, I know all about those killings. Oh, yeah, famous case." Turned out he was talking about something completely different. A completely different case that took place thousands of kilometres away. And this was a case that took place a few hours from where we were sitting, and he hadn't heard of it. And it kind of just got me cross,
Sure.
Here was the murder of 3 children. Nobody was doing anything about it, to the point where the detective was trying to get newspapers interested. And I remember talking about it to another colleague who shall remain nameless. And I said to him, "Oh, I'm thinking of doing something on this." And he said, "Leave it. It's old, it's cold, it's not going anywhere."
Wow.
And that was a damning indictment as well. Not of the industry, really, of the media industry, 3 kids were murdered, no one had gone to jail, and no one seemed to be doing anything about it. And eventually I did. But it did take me a long time to get around to it.
Sounds like it got in your head, and for whatever reason, which happens, you couldn't get to it at the time, or maybe it needed to sort of be in an incubator for a little while.
Yeah.
And then at some point, maybe you couldn't let it go, or you had to address it, right?
You know what it was podcasting, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
So I'd done a little bit for the paper, and written a few stories, but they ended up on the bottom of page 2. And if you work in newspapers, the bottom of page 2 is where the editors put stories that are boring, but they're important. Because it's up near the front of the book. So you're kind of saying this is important, but no one's ever going to read the bottom of page 2. And I couldn't get it off the bottom of that page. And I wrote a few things and it wasn't going anywhere. And then podcasting came along and serial came along.
Yep.
And I remember I came back one day to the office and I just thought, right, we're going to do this and we're going to do it as a podcast. And the reason is, if we do it as a podcast, you will hear the voices of the people involved talking for themselves.
Right.
It won't be me taking their words and putting them on my page or using my words to tell their story. You'll hear their words, their voices, their story.
Yeah.
And that will make people care. And so we did, and it worked. Because you can hear the emotion. Things like that, you can't do that on the page. But it's irresistible in podcasts.
It really is. And while we're talking about podcasting, I believe I read a quote of yours. I believe you said reporting on things like this should not be considered entertainment. Do I have that right?
Yeah, this is a big thing for me. This is kind of like my lonely campaign.
I don't think you're alone, but it's taking some people a little while to catch up.
Well, look, it's really interesting and it's a really difficult minefield because you're kind of caught between two things. So, okay, I'm talking particularly about true crime here, which is what I do. Particularly, I'm a crime reporter by training and by inclination. So you've got someone's life in your hands, and I mean not the victim's life, but their family's lives.
Right.
You go and talk to them. They open up to you. They trust you. They let you into their lives, and they tell you about the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to them. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine what it's like as a parent to have your child murdered. But they trust you with that story, and then it's up to you to go away and tell that story. But some people take that story and they turn it into entertainment. And, I'm not talking about turning it into drama, but you'll have heard podcasts and you'll have seen TV documentaries where it's dressed up, it's made into this thing that is there really to sell advertising, right, or to grab listeners' attention, because it's dressed up into something it's not. And that makes me really uncomfortable. I mean, it actually makes me really quite sick sometimes. But because there's kind of a counter argument to that as well, which is that if you're telling these people's stories, there's a reason to do that, isn't there? You're telling them because they're in the public interest. You want people to know about this case. Maybe you want the police to pay more attention to it, or you think an injustice has been done and it needs to be righted. So you need to get people to listen to that. And they're not going to listen to that if you do a bad version of telling the story. You have to make it interesting. You have to make it entertaining, because you can't expect the listener to do all the work of just going through the facts one after the other. So you do have to use some of the tools of entertainment to make this story something that people are going to want to listen to, so they will listen to it, so you can do your job of making sure people know about this story. So you've got to thread this kind of fine line between making it listenable, making people want to listen to it, but you can't just you got to do it for a reason, I think. I think that's how I've kind of reconciled it with myself. There's got to be a reason to tell this story.
There's this fine line, right? And there's a couple of different parts about it. One is, I think there's a big difference between an unsolved crime, a missing person, for example, that I'm working on now, or a murder, an obvious murder that's never been, like the story you're working on, no one's been charged. There's still work to be done, right? So the more ears, the more eyes on this story, the better chance that tip will come in that you need. And that's where, like what you're talking about, where, the more dramatic or the more compelling this story is, the more people will share it.
But it also goes back to, this is why the detective wanted to meet me at the start when I was a newspaper reporter, because he knew, and he's told me since. I mean, coincidentally, I was on the phone with him this morning. We're still in touch. He told me since that the investigations that get resourced in the police are the high-profile ones. So if you can get your case on the front page of the newspaper, then the politicians will pick that newspaper up, and then they'll pick up the phone and they'll ask the police commissioner questions about it. And that trickles down from the police commissioner to the officers under him. And then suddenly the investigation that had no one assigned to it has got a strike force assigned to it and a budget to run it. So there's reasons to get people listening about these cases.
Let's talk more about the story. There's 3 children were murdered within a few months of each other. You want to give us a little more background?
Yeah, so there's 3 children. There's Colleen, she's 16. There's Evelyn, she's 4. And Clinton, who is 16. They're all Aboriginal. They all are staying in this one town, Bowraville. And Bowraville's small. Then it was just over 1,000 people. But more than that, they're all staying on the same street. And you go there and you stand on that street, and the houses they're staying in at the time they go missing are 100 meters apart. Mm-hmm. They all disappear from that small stretch of ground over 5 months over the same summer. And we're going back a while now. This is the late 90s. And then 2 of the bodies turn up. Evelyn and Clinton's bodies are discovered months later, and they've been dumped beside a dirt road that leads out of Bowraville and goes up through the eucalyptus forest on the hills above it. And then after that, the clothes of Colleen, the 16-year-old girl, are found. They're dragged from a river, but they're dragged from the river where that same road, the one the other 2 bodies are dumped next to, goes over a bridge. So you've got 3 children disappear who were staying on one road. 2 bodies and 1 set of clothes are found essentially next to another road. And the police at the time don't treat them as connected crimes. Initially, they don't even really respond. So Colleen's mum goes and tries to report her daughter missing, and, can you come back tomorrow? You sure,
I want to clarify a term that Dan and I are about to mention. It's a term, walkabout. According to Wikipedia, walkabout is a rite of passage in Australian Aboriginal society during which males undergo a journey during adolescence, typically ages 10 to 16, and live in the wilderness for a period as long as 6 months to make a spiritual and traditional transition into manhood. She goes to the police, and the police say maybe they probably just went on a walkabout.
So this is where you get straightforwardly into racism. Walkabout is a term that is probably used more by white people about Aboriginal people than it is by Aboriginal people themselves, at least in my experience. And the idea is that Aboriginal people go on walkabout, meaning they just kind of, at least as white people understand it, they go off and they're doing Aboriginal people things, but they're kind of in the wind. God knows how many Aboriginal people will listen to that description and think I've just said something crude and stupid and potentially offensive. But even that's indicative of the fact that a lot of white people in Australia don't really understand Aboriginal people. In fact, I think the statistic is that most white people in Australia haven't even met an Aboriginal person. Aboriginal people are the indigenous population of the country, but it's a country that was colonised forcibly, so much like America. And there's this huge divide between the two. And so when each of the 3 children's families go to the police station and try and report their children missing, they're each told the same thing. Are you sure your kid hasn't just gone walkabout? Maybe they've just gone walkabout. Which is, it's a way, it shows you that the police, A, don't understand the Aboriginal culture they're meant to police. And it also kind of shows you that they're coming up with an excuse for doing nothing. And that is the response. Nothing gets done. So Colleen goes missing. The police barely respond. Evelyn goes missing. Same town. Same street. The police do look for her. They go looking for her. There's a decent effort to search houses, search rivers. And then, we don't think these two crimes are linked. And then it kind of dies down.
I just got to say, what 4-year-old goes on a walkabout?
Well, that's, yeah, absolutely. And then Clinton goes missing, and, I've spoken to the police who were there at the scene at the time. Clinton goes missing, and they start to worry. And then Clinton's body's found, so he's the first body to be found. And these detectives have said to me, right, at this point, alarm bells are ringing. We've now got a serial killer on the loose. And that's where we are today. So we're now, best part of 30 years later, those 3 kids have never seen any kind of justice. The person who killed them has never been convicted. And whoever killed those kids is a serial killer. And that serial killer is walking free today.
One thing you want to talk about Jack Hart in this interview, or?
What do you want to know?
Well, I'll just let the listeners know here that if I got this right, a very, very, very strong suspect, a guy who was present at all 3 of these parties or events when they went missing. And I think he was tried a couple times. Is that right?
Yeah. So each of these 3 kids goes missing after a party.
Just to be clear here, we're talking about 3 different parties on 3 different evenings.
A party which takes place on what they call the Bowraville Mission. So the Bowraville Mission is a part of the town of Bowraville where all the Aboriginal people are living. And it goes back to the kind of the colonial history of the country where the white fellas essentially set up segregated areas, which they called missions, in this case, for the Aboriginal people to live. And it's essentially, you go to Bowraville now and it's a completely segregated town. You've got the white part of town, which is where most people live, and then you've got the black part of town, which is where the Aboriginal people live in and around the mission. And it's between when the murders took place, it was between the cemetery and the piggery. And it had been on the other side of the road, but they moved it because the white folk wanted to build a golf course where the black folk were living. Okay. So they moved them off that onto what is now the mission. So anyway, each of these 3 kids disappears after a party. This guy, James Hart, is present at each of those parties. And he's a white guy. He's a big drinker, smokes a bit of dope, always turns up with alcohol. And he's had relationships or affairs with a few of the Aboriginal women in the community. So he's there when they all go missing. And then Clinton actually disappears from his caravan. Hart's living in a caravan at this point on his mum's property, and Clinton stays over that night. Clinton disappears from the caravan the next day, but Clinton's shoes are left just outside the caravan. And then, when Clinton's body is discovered, he's found with a pillowcase from Hart's caravan shoved down the front of his shorts. The more the police worked on it, they found that there was evidence from witnesses or from the accounts of the victims in the past that Hart had sort of sexually molested Colleen in the past. So he had a sexual interest in her. And that the night of Evelyn's disappearance, she was in bed with her mum, who was a fairly young woman at the time. Her mum woke up and her trousers were around her ankles, and Hart had been seen in that house late that night, in the early morning of the night. And then when Clinton woke up, he'd been in bed with his girlfriend, and she woke up in bed in Hart's caravan, and her trousers had been removed. And so there's all this, there's a kind of a pattern of offending, if you like, yeah. And I've got to stress at this point, you know, for every good legal reason, and also, I guess, just kind of moral reason, you know, Hart was put on trial over the murder of Clinton and later over the murder of Evelyn, and he was found not guilty both times. So as it stands, you know, eyes of the law, the guy is not guilty.
After the break, we'll learn how a not guilty verdict was reached despite seemingly overwhelming evidence. We're talking with Dan Box from his home in the UK. Dan is a crime reporter and host of the podcast Bowraville about the unsolved murders of 3 Aboriginal children in Australia. We are back with true crime reporter Dan Box talking about his podcast Bowraville. I asked Dan to explain how this strong suspect named Jay Hart could have been found not guilty.
Okay, so step back. You've got a guy who the police like for these murders, and they suspect him right from the start. And when I met that detective decades later, he still thought Hart was his best suspect, right. and he was still pursuing him. So it gets to court, and something happens where you've got 3 murders, which to you and me, and, you know, any kind of layman looking at them, you'd think there's a connection between them. The kids all disappear from the same street at the same sort of time. The bodies are found within a kind of all connected to that road. But the courts look at that at the time and they say, right, well, we're not going to hear those cases together because according to the laws at the time, the evidence that connects them isn't good enough to say that they were definitely committed by the same person. And if we hear them together, then it might be prejudicial to Hart, who is the suspect at this point, to hear them all together. So we're going to hear them separately. Okay. But what the effect of that is that the jury only ever hear that one child disappeared from Bowraville. So the jury are kind of essentially told an untruth. They're told, in the case of, say, Clinton's murder, Clinton disappears from Bowraville. No one mentions that 2 of the kids disappear in similar circumstances in the months before that. No one mentions that another body is found next to the same road that Clinton's is discovered. And so they find him not guilty. In fairness, there's no DNA, because this was before DNA technology was available. And there's no eyewitness that puts him there. And the other thing is that because the police didn't do an awful lot about these disappearances at the time, you don't know what evidence they missed because they weren't out there treating this as a potential, you know, triple homicide right from the start. So you don't know what was lost from that lack of action. So he's found not guilty of Clinton's murder. Years and years later, the police have another go at it. And this is under the detective I spoke to, who's kind of been the driving force for a long, long time. And they try him over Evelyn's murder. Same thing, though. The jury are only told about one murder. And there's conflicting evidence. And he's found not guilty again. And that's kind of where it sat for decades.
So where are we now?
Where are we now? So we did that podcast and it just got some traction. It went gangbusters. And I think it was a 5-part series. And we had part 4, they'd all gone out, and we had like a few days to get part 5 together, and it had been scripted and edited, and it was all ready to go. But we'd constantly been trying to get in touch with Hart himself. You know, partly because you want to see if he's going to talk, and partly because you've got to ask his side of the story. It's only fair. So right from the start, I'd been driving up to where he was living, which wasn't in Bowraville anymore, knocking on his door, trying his phone, and getting absolutely nowhere. And we gave it one last shot, and we drove up outside his door, nothing. Got back to the office the next day, and there's an answer phone lights flashing on my phone, and I pick it up, and it's him, and he's called me at work, and he just says, this is James Hart. I want to talk to you. So I've been saying James, and it's Jay, and I am. Oh. The reason for that is I'm looking at your name on this Google Meet screen.
Oh, it's Jay Hart, yeah.
It's Jay Hart.
Okay. And I think I've been saying Jack Hart, but it's Jay Hart.
Okay, so look, we've both been wrong. The truth is that his name's Jay Hart. Look, so I get back to the office, and the answer phone light's flashing red, and I pick it up, and there's this voice, and it's dull, heavy voice, and he says, "Hi Dan, this is Jay Hart. I think you've been trying to talk to me, and this is my number." And so I call him back, and I record the call, and he picks up and he talks. And the thing is, he has never spoken before. He has never spoken to the police about all 3 murders. He declined to give evidence in court. He declined to give evidence at an inquest. And he spoke to the police right at the beginning about Clinton, and that's it for decades. And then he's on the phone.
So I listened to that episode. Did I get it right that he said he had been listening to the podcast?
Yeah, he'd been listening to the podcast. And so he's on the phone, and no preparation, nothing. And I'm literally standing there doing an interview with a guy who the police suspect to be a serial killer, and he's answering every question. He's answering it, and he knows the case. I get the feeling that he is literally sitting surrounded by court documents. So when I say, well, what about this? It's almost like he reaches for the pile of documents and says, well, you have to remember that in such and such this happened, and you can't trust that evidence for that reason. Mm-hmm. Or at court, this happened, and that was discounted for that reason. He has an answer for everything, but his answers aren't always very convincing. So I mentioned how one of the victims, Clinton, was found with Jay Hart's pillow slip down his shorts. And so I asked Jay about that, and Jay says, well, maybe he'd gone looking for some pot, and he took my pillow slip to carry the pot home in, because there were kind of, illegal cannabis plantations in the woods there. And I was just like, what? So he walked. So my thought process is, you're saying that Clinton walked barefoot at night several kilometers into the woods to carry with your pillow slip to collect cannabis. Mm-hmm. But that's his version. And what he says over and over again is, but it's a possibility. And like the judge said in the court, as long as there's another possibility that explains these facts, then you can't find me guilty. He comes back to that again and again. And the thing is, he's absolutely right. That is how the court works.
Did he ever say he's not guilty?
Yeah, he denies it. He straight up denies it as well, and continues to deny it, and always has. But he's on the phone, and so the last episode then becomes essentially this long conversation with the suspect at the heart of this. And the other thing that happens while this is going on, because I'm working on a newspaper, I remember, but the day we launched, the editor shut himself in his office and he listened to the first 4 episodes back to back. Mm-hmm. And he walked out and he walked past my desk and he just put his hand down on it and he said, "We are going to send this guy to court." And after that, the newspaper just started to campaign. So I thought we might write a small piece in the paper and it would get on the bottom of page 2 and that would be great. But suddenly the editor is saying he wants a story every single day. And a lot of them are running off the front page. And what a newspaper like that can do, so it goes back to what the detective was saying. At that point, politicians start asking questions about it. And my editor deliberately, and this is an editor's privilege, I guess. He's deliberately targeting the Attorney General. So he's running my news stories, but he's also running comment pieces saying, where is the Attorney General in this? Is she blind to the racism that's been going on in this case? What is she going to do about it?
Yeah.
And there's some lobbying that's going on behind the scenes as well, between the paper and the politicians about, are you going to sort this out? And so those two things together, the fact that this podcast goes gangbusters, people are listening to it, the newspaper's now campaigning on it, the families are campaigning on it as well. They're marching on the state parliament and holding demonstrations. And at the same time, the police are quite openly saying, we're going to put another application in to send this back to court. And if I'm honest, the newspaper and the police and the families are all cooperating at this point. It's a concerted campaign. You've got this idea of journalistic objectivity that you're supposed to step back and not get involved. And yeah, that's great. But also, 3 kids were murdered and no one's ever been jailed for it. So at this point, objectively, I think that's wrong. And so I do kind of lose that classic journalistic detachment. I'd like it to go to court, and my newspaper is campaigning for it to go to court. And then it goes to court. The Attorney General comes back and says, right, we are going to send this to court. We're going to send it to the appeal court and see if they'll overturn those not guilty verdicts. And I found out afterwards that a big part of the reason for that was in the interview that Jay Hart did with me. I asked him, well, how would you feel if this went back to court? And he said, look, I wouldn't welcome it because it's a lot of stress on the family and it's a lot of stress on financially, but there is a part of me that would like to see it go to court because it's an opportunity to clear my name. Huh. And apparently when the Attorney General's lawyers heard that, it removed a big obstacle in terms of the procedural fairness of sending it to court. So all of these things came together. It's like a perfect storm. And, I was caught up in the middle of it. And at this point, I'm kind of a passenger to it. Yeah. And he gets sent back to court and it goes to the appeal court. And, courts take years and everything slows down. But it gets to court and the appeal court hears it. And it's the first time ever that those 3 murders have been discussed in the same criminal court at the same time, because they'd always been treated as separate cases. Right. But now you've got judges saying, okay, let's talk about all 3 of them. And you've got lawyers arguing about the connections between them and the similarities between them. And the appeal court hears the case and it hands down its verdict and it says...
Find out what the appeals court decided and why after this short break. Now back to Dan Box and our discussion about the podcast Bowraville.
And the appeal court hears the case and it hands down its verdict and it says... we are not going to overturn those not guilty verdicts. That's it. We're going to let them stand. But the reason they say that is really complicated. And it comes down to, and this is where you get into questions about what is justice. Because, at this point you've had an appeal court hearing. So it's gone to almost the highest court in the country. And they've heard it in full and they've handed down their verdict. And you could say that is the justice system. It has played out. But the reason that they give for not overturning those not guilty verdicts isn't because of the strength of the evidence. It's because of a procedural reason. So they're saying that the way some of that evidence was tendered or not tendered at the time of the original trials means that essentially some of it is now inadmissible. And what it comes down to is actually the definition of a single word in the legislation. And that word is the word adduced, which basically means that evidence has been presented to a court or tendered to a court. But the exact definition of that word isn't given in the legislation. So it could mean that evidence is able to be presented to a court, or it could mean that the evidence is tendered to the court, which means the court has accepted it as evidence. And so the appeal court kind of basically comes down and said, look, there was some evidence at the time that could have been adduced, i.e. presented to the court, but wasn't for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. Therefore, for legal reasons, because of the way this legislation is written, it could have been adduced. It wasn't adduced. Therefore, it's not admissible now. And so the whole thing falls on the fact that some of this evidence wasn't presented to a court at the time, and that the definition of adduced the appeal court judges are taking means that means it is inadmissible now. And, all 3 families are sitting in court to hear that. And there's this huge disconnect between, you've got the families. These are Aboriginal families from a small country town. Some of them have taken, coaches for 6 or 7 hours to be here. And you've got these all white judges, all white court, all white police officers, all white lawyers, all white reporters, sitting there. It's just 2 very different worlds. And the white judges are saying, look, this meaning of this word in our laws means that we're never going to overturn those not guilty verdicts. So there won't be anyone sent to jail for the murder of your children. And you've got these black families just looking at that. And I remember talking to the mum of one of those kids, so the youngest kid, Evelyn, who was murdered, immediately after that verdict came down. And she said, I just didn't understand a word of what they were saying.
Right.
Because the judges are talking in, legalese. It's complicated. I remember reading their judgment the next day, and I had to go through it 3 or 4 times to really understand what they were saying. These families didn't have a chance to understand that. All they knew was that there was not going to be anyone put on trial or sent to jail for the killing of their children.
Well, I just want to say, everyone listening, that even though you just sort of heard the outcome of this trial, please listen to this podcast. It's riveting. I got to ask you, were you ever, like when you went out to try to find Jay Hart in the podcast, were you scared at all?
Yeah, there was one moment, but it's a funny story. Jay was living in a pretty, not that rough enough part of the world now. And we turned up with a plan to stake him out. So we were literally just going to park our car, sit in there and wait for him to come back. As a newspaper reporter, you kind of get used to doing that, but that was the plan for the day. But I hadn't thought it through. So I turned up in a brand new car that we'd borrowed from the company fleet. And it just happened to be that this one was brand new. I was wearing a collared shirt, and no one on that street was driving a brand new car or wearing a collared shirt. And we drive up, and I hadn't done a recce of his place properly. So we drove up, and I kind of thought the only place I can park the car is behind this boat that was parked up opposite. Someone had just parked their boat on the side of the road. So I parked there, and we sat there, and then within minutes, people in the street knew we were there, and they were looking at us, and they were talking about us quite openly, like in the street, pointing at us, gangs of men, and the group just got bigger and bigger and bigger and closer and closer. And then I looked up in the rearview mirror, and I can see a pair of eyes looking through the back window straight at me.
Oh my gosh.
One bloke slams on the side of the window, demands to know who we are, demands to have photo ID. What do we think we're doing here? It turns into a fairly ugly exchange, a fairly ugly crowd scene where I'm basically saying, look, he said, are you cops? Brand new car, collared shirt, are you cops? No, we're not cops, we're journalists. He doesn't believe me. We get out of the car, we talk it down, we're fine. And then after that, this old woman who lives there comes up to me and says, look, the real reason everyone was so angry was you parked your car right outside the house where someone had been arrested the week before for child abuse. And so we turned up, a bunch of strangers with a big camera, because we had a photographer for the paper there, and they'd kind of got it into their heads that we were either cops or we were paedophiles, that we were some kind of paedophile friend of the guy who'd been arrested from this house.
Oh, right.
So I'd managed to park my car outside an accused paedophile's house, convincing everyone that I was also a paedophile. When I finally convinced them we were journalists, they basically settled down. But yeah, that was the only moment I thought things were going to get a bit difficult.
I was going to say, don't you feel like you've done a great work?
I kind of come and go with that one. I'm really proud of that podcast. I'm proud of it because it was hard and we did a good job, and it was, it's a once in a career opportunity for someone like Jay Hart, a suspected serial killer, to call you up at work and then agree to be recorded. Yeah. That's never probably going to happen to me again. So I'm proud of all of that. And I'm proud of being part of that campaign that got it sent back to court. Mm-hmm. Could always have done better though, couldn't you? There's 2 things that really bug me is, there's a lot of families of these kids out there, and some of them, they weren't desperately impressed with, the way I'd reported on it. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. Mm-hmm. All of the parents of the kids that I spoke to have always been really good, have always been on side, but not everyone thinks I'm the best person to have done it. And partly I'm a white fella turning up and telling a black community story, and that's never ideal. And the other thing is that the judges in the appeal court, when they did say we're not going to send this back to court, they said you needed fresh and compelling evidence to get this sent back to court. And the only bit of fresh evidence that we think you've really got is that interview that Dan Box did with Jay Hart, which had been tendered as part of the evidence during the appeal. They said that's completely fresh. That could never have been tendered in court before. Right. But it's not compelling. I didn't ask the right question. If I'd asked just one more question, and it had been the question that Jay Hart stumbled over, assuming Jay Hart is the guy who did it and he's been found not guilty and he's got every right to presumption of innocence, but maybe if I'd asked the right question and got the right answer, then maybe the judges would have said that interview is both fresh and compelling. And then maybe we wouldn't be having this conversation today.
Dan Box, thank you so much for joining us on Dakota Spotlight. It's been a real pleasure.
Hey, thank you for your time. I'm really grateful.
This was Dan Box talking about the podcast Bowraville. Check out Bowraville anywhere you get your podcasts. I'll spell the title for you one more time. It's Bowraville, Bowraville. My name is James Wollner, and this is Dakota Spotlight, a production of Forum Communications. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.